The Sparks Museum podcast is made possible by a grant from the Nevada Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities. The podcast is just one of many new features of the Sparks Heritage Museum. To learn more, check out our social media channels or our website at www.sparksmuseum.org. Hello, and welcome to the Sparks Museum podcast. I'm your host and the media manager for the Sparks Heritage Museum, Jessica Johnson. In 1902, the Southern Pacific Railroad purchased a large tract of swampland near its newly built rail yard in what is presently Sparks, Nevada, after moving its division point from Wadsworth, Nevada. The railroad offered Wadsworth rail workers and their families a deed to a 50-foot by 140-foot lot for the sum of just $1. They also offered to pick up and move every house in Wadsworth and reassemble it in this new town free of charge. As the population increased, a city was established, and hence, the Rail City was born. Today on the podcast, I sit down with Adam Michalski, the current curator of education at the Nevada State Railroad Museum in Carson City. Adam discusses the history of the railroads in this region of Nevada and the various steam and electric-powered locomotives and vehicles that built the economy and population of Sparks in its earliest years. He also discusses his own history studying railroads and some of the recent efforts of the Nevada State Railroad Museum. Please welcome to the podcast, Adam Michalski. Thank you so much for being with us on the Sparks Museum podcast today.
Thanks, Jessica, for having me. Appreciate it.
So I want to start off with the question that I ask all of our guests. The first question is, what is your personal connection, if any, to the city of Sparks?
So I would say my personal connection to the city of Sparks is that I live in Reno, and I've been living in Reno for about almost 9 years. So I feel like my personal connection to Sparks is that I have lots of friends that live in this area, so I visit pretty often. I like to go to various businesses in the area. And so for me, it's like I just like to come and visit and shop here, visit with my friends that live here, those types of things. So yeah, I like to do that type of stuff.
That is excellent. Now, I would love to get some background on you. So where do you presently work? How did you get there? What was your journey?
Well, that's a good question. So I've been working at the Nevada State Railroad Museum since 2014. There, I am the curator of education for the Railroad Museum. I've been working in museums since 2010. I started out my career at the San Antonio Conservation Society in San Antonio, Texas. I worked as a museum attendant at the Steve's Homestead. And then from there, I worked at various museums in Texas, the Institute of Texan Cultures, and at Casa Navarro, which is owned by the Texas Historical Commission. All those museums are based in San Antonio. And so I was working there till about 2014. And then the position here at the Nevada State Railroad Museum opened up for curator of education. And initially, I didn't think I was qualified for the job. I have a master's degree in history, and I studied railroad history as part of that. And so that's just been one of my interests in life is from railroad history. But I still didn't think I was kind of qualified for the position, but then the position just kept remaining open. And then finally I was like, I might as well apply for it. And then I did, and eventually got the job here at the Nevada State Railroad Museum. And I've been really excited to be working there for the past almost 9 years. So yeah, it'll be 9 years in January. So yeah, it's been a lot of fun working there, and it's been a long journey to get here, but I really enjoy it quite a bit.
So what is it about railroad or transportation that really interests you?
So to me, I've been interested, since I was a kid, I was interested in trains. I originally grew up in Wisconsin, and I lived near this railroad junction, which was just south of Milwaukee. And so I used to like to go out and watch trains. I would take pictures of trains. I would, my parents and I, we would plan a lot of our family trips around going to either baseball stadiums, which I also enjoy baseball. So did my sister, and then like railroad museums. And so it was kind of nice for both of us because like my sister and I, we could go to, baseball games. My dad liked baseball. but then also I could go see trains and go to museums. And so we'd go to just see various museums. That's how we'd plan a lot of our trips. So I was always just really interested in trains ever since I was growing up. But I've also been interested in just the whole realm of transportation. I have an undergraduate degree in urban studies from the University of Minnesota. And from there, so when I was in that field, I studied transportation planning, urban development, city planning, those types of issues. And so from there, I was really interested in like transit systems and how they work, figuring out where roads and highways should go, like how you plan those. And then, like railways, I was just always interested in railroads. Like I also used to work, when I was in grad school, I worked at Northwest Airlines as a ramp agent in St. Louis when I went to grad school there. So I've had this varied background and interest in just transportation in all different forms. It doesn't matter what it is. Even when I plan trips, when I travel other places, I'm always looking for the most complicated route so I can get all the transportation options I can.
Wow, planes, trains, and automobiles.
Really everything.
Runs the gamut. Yep. We previously have had Dick Dreiling on talking about the Lillard Park train depot that we have across the way and the different cars that are there because he gives tours of that area. And also Jim Bonar, who talked about the Lincoln Highway. So I'm sure your arrival here, getting to know Nevada's transportation systems, that Sparks was a primary topic because of the passage of the Lincoln Highway, the fact that the railroad is such a primary part of Sparks's history. So what did you find in your research that interested you the most about Sparks's purpose in the past century?
So as being interested in railroad history, I always find that I found that, Sparks is basically here because of the railroad. It was a railroad town in 1900. When you look at the year 1900, like there was Reno. Reno was established, but Sparks did not even exist. It was just nobody even thought of Sparks even being there. But then as there were some various, it was kind of interesting the way that the city of Sparks was formed in the early 1900s. But it all dates back even to the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, 30 years earlier. And so you see, when the railroad first arrived in Truckee Meadows on May 4th, 1868, and from there, so it arrived in Reno and coming from the west over the Sierra. And then about a week later, the railroad makes its way through what's currently Sparks today and into the lower Truckee River Canyon. So that construction is completed around that time. And then the final connection over the Sierra at Truckee was completed in June of 1868. And so that finally at that point, you could have trains that came from Sacramento all the way over the Sierra into Reno and the Truckee Meadows and present-day Sparks. And so so by that time, so you had this construction of the railroad. And then fast forward a few years later, about 20 years later or so, the Central Pacific Railroad, which is the railroad that built the line through Reno and Sparks, current-day Reno and Sparks. At that time, they're bought by the Southern Pacific Railroad, and the Southern Pacific Railroad is looking at different ways to improve the transportation on this line between Sacramento and Salt Lake or Ogden, Utah. And so they're looking at different ways to improve the route. And so at that point, in around 1900, the Southern Pacific is looking at different ways to improve this route. And then in 1902, E.H. Harriman, he was the president of the Union Pacific Railroad. The Union Pacific Railroad has just purchased the Southern Pacific, and they are looking at all these different ways to improve the route. And so they decide between what's present-day Sparks and Ogden that they're going to make various improvements because the route that they used was the original route from the 1860s when they first completed the railroad. And the route at that time, they were just trying to get it done as quickly as possible across Nevada, and so they didn't really engineer it quite as well as it could have been engineered. And so there was a lot of various curves, like sharp curves and high gradients. And so they wanted to pare those back, and also they wanted to make like different cutoffs so that didn't have to, so they could avoid a lot of the mountains in the areas, because since Nevada is so mountainous, it makes sense to try to avoid as many of those mountains as possible. So then between 1902 and about 1909, the Union Pacific upgrades the route, and they cut off several miles of track. They improved the gradients. Before the route was open, the maximum grading was about 1.8%, which is really high for a railroad. Usually a railroad works best when it's on a level surface. And so because you have steel wheels on steel rail, and so it just makes more sense to operate on a flat surface. So having a 1.8% grade is pretty steep. After the improvements, most of the maximum grades were 0.4%. So you had a steep drop off in the amount of grades that the railroad had to go over. And they also reduced the curvature on a lot of the different routes. They also just built new sections of track to make it easier to operate their trains. And so after all these upgrades in 1909, the railroad cut off about 3 hours and 20 minutes of travel time between Ogden and Sacramento.
Wow.
And that's a huge difference from what it was, even before the improvements were made. And so when you think about that too, like that also meant that a lot of the division points along the way had to be changed. The division points are where like one division of a railroad meets another division point, and that's kind of like a center of operations for that stretch of track. And so there were about 4 division points between Sacramento and Ogden, and so then they cut those down to 2, and one of them happened to be Sparks. And so in 1903, the railroad decides that they're going to move all their operations from the town of Wadsworth, which is about 30 miles east of here, and they decided to move them to Sparks. So Sparks at that time didn't really exist. It was sometimes called East Reno. It was also called Glendale, and it was also called Harriman for a brief time. But E.H. Harriman came to Sparks, and he came to Harriman, and he decided, I don't want my name associated with the town. So they named it after John Sparks, who was a rancher and governor of Nevada at the time. And so in 1904, the city of Sparks is formed. And so that's when the railroad starts really building up this area. They had to move everything from Wadsworth, all of the, not only the buildings and structures, but also the people and everybody that worked there. So they all had to move in the spring of 1904 to Sparks. And so even in that case, like some of the employees actually moved their houses on a train. They would put the houses on a flat car and bring them over to Sparks, and then they could move, and they put their houses down in Sparks. All sorts of new facilities had to be built, including a 40-stall roundhouse, which was the largest roundhouse west of Chicago. So they had to build that here in Sparks, because this was going to become a major division point for the Southern Pacific Railroad.
So even though the Southern Pacific Railroad moved on post the 1950s with the switch out of the steam era, we still see in the blueprint of the city how important that the railroad remains. I mean, the fact that a good stretch of it runs right along the highway, along I-80. So are these routes still the same routes that were a part of the original railroad, or how is that railroad used today?
So like when we talk about Sparks specifically, so the railroad is pretty much similar to what it was, the same route from the 1950s. Prior to that, Prater Way, prior to the improvements that were made under the Union Pacific in the early 1900s, in 1904 they switched the route. It was actually along Prater Way. That's the old alignment of the Central Pacific Railroad. Southern Pacific used to be Prater Way, which is just right outside the studios here.
Yeah.
And so that was the old CP right away, because they had initially wanted to build the railroad where it is currently today. However, there was a flood in 1868, and so they had to align the tracks in a different pattern around the flooding across the because there used to be wetlands there. And so when they realigned the railroad in the early 1900s, they decided to move back to the original right-of-way that they had planned to build on. And so that's why that's where the railroad is today. So the railroad through Sparks is where it is today since about 1904.
Now, with the loss of the roundhouse, it therein necessitated the use of another roundhouse, I'm sure, nearby. Do you know where that location would have been?
So they used the roundhouse until about the 1950s. And so what's interesting is the roundhouse was built in the early 1900s. It was the largest roundhouse west of Chicago. It had 40 stalls. The shops here in Sparks at that time, around 1920 or so, it had about 850 to 900 employees. And this was because steam locomotives were very difficult to maintain. You had to take a steam locomotive off about every 100 miles for servicing. So this was a good point to do that when you're coming from Sacramento. And so when you come over Donner Pass and get to Sparks, it's a good stopping point where you can just take off a locomotive here and put a new one on, and then it would continue on its way to Imlay, which is just east of Winnemucca. And so there was like this. So there was a lot of, the Southern Pacific had a lot of employees based here in Sparks for a number of years. And so the shops were really integral to that between 1904 and about 1956. And so you see they even expanded. The Southern Pacific actually expanded its shops during World War II in 1942. Between 1942 and 1944, they built the Sparks back shops. And this was because they were experiencing a lot of traffic during the war effort, during World War II. And so there's a lot of freight trains that were coming over Donner Pass, and Sparks just seemed to be the right place to service those locomotives. And so what they actually did was the railroad actually brought an old shop that was in El Paso, Texas, and they took it apart brick by brick and moved it here to Sparks in 1942, 1943. And so they reconstructed those shops, and it opened in February of 1944. And so those back shops were used to service these larger locomotives that were being used over Donner Pass. But what's interesting about that is that even though the shop was completed in 1944, it was obsolete within about 10 years. So in the post-war era, after 1945, you see a big shift on railroads, and especially out here in the West, where they're switching from steam locomotives to diesel locomotives. Diesel locomotives were especially popular for Western railroads because of the lack of water out West. And so the Western railroads were really quick to dieselize their locomotive fleets. And so and it also turned out that like one diesel locomotive at that time had the capacity to carry had a capacity to pull about 1,250 tons. Wow. And a steam locomotive at that time, a comparable steam locomotive, could pull about 1,500 tons. However, it's just more expensive to maintain the steam locomotives. What was nice about the diesel locomotives, you could put about 3 or 4 together, and they could operate from just one locomotive. You could just have one locomotive operate all 4 of them. So you didn't need an engineer and a crew for each locomotive, whereas with a steam locomotive, you needed a crew for every steam locomotive on the train. So this was a way to save on labor costs. It was also, having diesels like this, you could save on labor costs, and you could stack 3 or 4 together, and you get the same amount of effort as opposed to putting 2 or 3 steam locomotives that each had their own crews. And also they were more fuel efficient than the steam locomotives. So during some testing in the 1940s, the Southern Pacific found that on one of the freight trains that they were operating across Nevada, it only needed about 3,500 or so gallons of fuel to get across a stretch of track, whereas a steam locomotive at that time was using about 5,000 to 6,000 gallons
Oh,
of
wow.
fuel. And multiply that by 3 locomotives, so that's a lot of fuel you're talking about. So it was a way to save a lot of money. Even though the diesel locomotives were more expensive, they were finding that they could save about $1,000 a day just by operating. About $1,000 a month just by operating these more efficient diesel locomotives. As the steam locomotives are phased out, the diesels are just more. They're more efficient, so they can go a lot farther than the steam locomotives can. They can just cross entire divisions, and like they could run from Ogden all the way to Sacramento without having to be taken off and serviced. They could just service them at those 2 endpoints. And so what you see is this drop off in roundhouses that are needed and shops. So the Sparks shops eventually close in the late 1950s, around 1956. And so that's just it's a big blow to the local economy, especially when you had about 1,000 people working at those shops. And then after that point, you don't need as many employees.
Absolutely. It's been very interesting to track the different images of the city that they have taken on since the closure of the railroad, of trying to become a tourist destination or take on the Victorian theming of that downtown area. And now it's very much themed towards families, as we've discussed previously on the podcast as well. So I think trying to find an identity after the true cause of your city's existence goes away was a very interesting transition for the city to make.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's so after the railroad, after they closed their shops in the 1950s, you kind of see a decline in the railroad up until about the 1990s through this area. Prior to the 1950s, like railroads, they were a huge business. They're still a huge business, but but back at that time, they employed a lot more people. As we were talking about with the SP, like they were one of the largest, if not the largest, employers here in the city of Sparks prior to the 1950s. And then as those shops go away in 1956, now you start to see even further declines. There used to be for example, there used to be the Southern Pacific used to operate passenger trains, and these trains would generally run between Ogden and Oakland or to Sacramento. And at that time, around 1960 or so, there was still about 8 passenger trains a day running through Reno and Sparks at that time. Sparks was a really important point for the passenger trains, because they would service the trains there. They would refuel the passenger trains. They would add supplies here in Sparks. And so even that kind of dries up during the 1960s. And a lot of this has to do with the completion of the interstate, or the development of the interstate highway system. The interstate highway system started around 1956, and this was put into place by President Dwight D. Eisenhower. And so after that point, you see the construction of interstate highways, and I-80 is one of those main thoroughfares that's constructed across the United States. And so during that time, there's just a lot of construction of I-80. The I-80 is completed through Reno and Sparks around 1974. And so at that point, you see US 40, which was the main highway, the Lincoln Highway. That was like the main highway across northern Nevada, along with Highway 50, which went farther south through Carson City. But you see that those routes that were very important to automobile traffic during the early part of the 20th century, those highway routes become less important. And so then you see here in Sparks, a lot of those businesses that depended on that automobile traffic, a lot of the motels, things like that, they kind of lose a lot of their business, and they become run down because now everybody can travel on the highways, and then people can drive on interstates and get to their destinations a lot more quicker. You can just kind of bypass all of these towns. And I mean, when you're on the interstate, you're just, zooming by through Reno. Like you can just get through Reno in like 5-10 minutes on a good day and just continue on your way. Whereas when you had Highway 40 and Lincoln Highway, you were just driving straight through the middle of these downtown areas, and you could stop. You might see a business, you want to stop there, or it was just a slower way of travel. So you'd maybe just want to stop and stay overnight, say in Sparks, at one of the motels, and even along that whole route along Prater Way, along Avenue B, which is now Victorian Avenue. Like all those areas used to have a lot of more motels, and I mean some of them are still existing today, but they're not as prevalent as they used to be. So you just kind of see this big shift in you see this big shift in the way that people are using transportation starting in the 50s, 60s, and 70s in that era.
Yeah, and very much in the ways in which it still continues to impact visitors and residents today.
Oh, absolutely. And even today, like you just see that because now Sparks and the Truckee Meadows, I mean, it's become more auto oriented. So you can even see that with a lot of the expanding highways in the area, like Veterans Parkway. I mean, that's used as a way to get traffic from the south end of Reno up to Sparks, and to shift those traffic patterns around. So there's just like all these various ways that we've expanded the roadways, so now we've become more auto oriented. We're less inclined to use trains or transit, things like that.
Now, a feature that is no longer around today, but something that has been looked upon by visitors to the museum very fondly, either as memories themselves or memories that a family member had, is the now no longer in service streetcar that ran. Well, was that 4th Street in Prater?
Yes. So there used to be a streetcar line that operated between the SP Depot in downtown Reno and the Sparks shops here in Sparks. And so it was about a 4.5 mile long line, and it was originally built by the Nevada Traction Company. And so this line was built it started construction on October 1st, 1904. And what I find amazing is that the line was completed by Thanksgiving of 1904.
Wow.
So in about a month and a half, it took them to build this route between Reno and Sparks. I'm just thinking about today where you'd have to do a lot of like studies and everything.
Yeah.
It would take years to build that line. So it's just kind of interesting like how they were able to complete this line really quickly. And so the line itself actually operated from the Sparks Roundhouse, which would be near Pyramid Way today. It's actually, and then it would actually run past it was B Avenue. It would run past that, which is now Victorian Avenue. And so they would run right past the museum today if it were still existing. And then it would run all the way along 4th Street into downtown Reno, and it would make its way to the to the SP Depot in downtown Reno.
And what was the main function of that? Was it purely tourist, or was it actually used as a regular part of residents' commute?
Yeah, absolutely. It was definitely used by commuters and shoppers. So when the line opened on November 24th, 1904, that day they had 3,000 riders.
Oh my gosh.
Yes, and there was a lot of demand for this service because it just made it a lot easier to get between between Sparks and all of the commercial center was Reno. And so that's where a lot of the shopping and the shopping was done and things like that. So it just made it a lot easier to get to Reno. The route, the fare was 10 cents, and the ride lasts about 15 to 20 minutes to get to downtown, Reno. And so this was just a really easy way for people in Sparks to get over to Reno. And also it made it easier for commuters from Reno, like the SP employees that lived in Reno. They could get to Sparks more easily to work in the shops here in Sparks.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
How long was it in service?
So the line that ran between Reno and Sparks was in service until 1927. And so even before that, like between 1905 and 1910, eventually the service became the Reno Traction Company, and they actually had a fairly extensive route network throughout the city of Reno too. So they had the one line from Reno to Sparks. That was the main the main line. That was where about 80% of the ridership came from for this streetcar. But they also had lines in Reno that went from downtown to UNR, down 2nd Street to Keystone Avenue. They had a line that went south to the Wells Avenue in the Wells Avenue neighborhood. They also had a line that went to Plumas and California Avenues in Reno, which connected to another route called the Nevada Interurban, which served the Moana Hot Springs, the baths, which was pretty fascinating. So they had all these various lines throughout Reno. And they also actually had a temporary line that would go to the fairgrounds.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, where the Reno Rodeo is today. They would build that during the summer months, and then they would take it out at the end of the season, and then just keep rebuilding it every year. So those routes in Reno actually lasted till about 1919, because after that point, in the teens, you start to see ridership decline as automobiles become more prevalent. People want to take their cars. So, for example, the route between Sparks and Reno. Trains operated about every half an hour. The streetcars operated every half hour from about 6:30 a.m. till about midnight, and that's fairly frequent. But if you're using an automobile, it's totally different. Like, you can just get in your car and go whenever you want. You don't have to be on a fixed schedule, and you don't have to live near a streetcar stop to get on the train and go somewhere. You can just get in your car. You can just drive, get to your destination. Usually more quickly, and you could do it at your own pace, at your own leisure. So you see this big decline in the streetcar patronage. So in 1919, all of the Public Service Commission of Nevada allows the Reno Traction Company to abandon all of their lines in Reno. The one that remains is the line between Reno and Sparks, because there is still quite a bit of patronage on that route. But however, over the course of the 1920s, that service tends to decline. More people get cars, there's better roads. And then even the Reno Traction Companies they just want to get out of the business altogether of the streetcars. So they're making it, at that time, they're making it even less attractive as an option to ride streetcars. The windows on the cars are cold and drafty in the winter. It's just the seats are the cars aren't very clean. They're encouraging people to get away from using the streetcar and using other transportation options, because they're losing a lot of money every year on this service. So finally, in September of 1927, on September 2nd, 1927, the Public Service Commission decides that the Reno Traction Company no longer has to operate their streetcars. And so on September 6, 1927, that's the final day of service of the streetcar between Reno and Sparks.
Wow. Another relic of a bygone era.
Yes.
Wow. Well, it's a shame. I feel like a lot of people today would have a renewed interest in that sort of transportation, if nothing else for the novelty of it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know I would.
Oh, yeah, me too.
Yeah, and it's I would definitely like to ride streetcars, and even today I'm like rail too, like a light rail system. I always like riding transit wherever I go. It's just experiencing the transit system. So yeah, it would be great to have another rail system between Sparks and Reno sometime.
I'm going to take a pause here because I see you got a lot of notes. So is there something that you had researched or put down that we haven't covered yet? I just want to make sure that we cover everything.
So I was just even thinking about too, like when you look at the shift in the economy here in Sparks, one of the big things that happens in 1949 is the state of Nevada decides to allow tax-free warehouse storage.
Oh, wow.
And so this is relevant even today. So like what happened? So what that means is in a lot of other states, companies pay taxes on their products that they're storing in their warehouses. And so even though they're for sale, and the companies are trying to move these products, they still have to pay a tax on storing them until they're finally sold. So that raises the cost of those products. So in 1949, the state of Nevada decides that they're just going to allow for tax-free warehousing, meaning that you can just store your products here in a warehouse. You don't have to pay a tax on having them just sit there overnight, or for it could be days, months, however long. So you don't have to pay those taxes, and that becomes a really big shift in the industries here in Northern Nevada and in Sparks especially. Because even today, that still is relevant today. So at that point, in 1949, when this is instituted, now what you can do is you can store all these products here, and then you can ship them to the bigger markets in California and up and down the West Coast. And it just makes it, but because you're still really close to California, to the Bay Area, Sacramento. So you can just store those products here, and then when they need them, they can get them on demand, and then they can just ship them overnight to their destinations in California. So this is a big development, and even you see that today, where that shift is really important to the Sparks economy today. You have a lot of warehouses here for companies like Walmart and PetSmart, Amazon, that they store a lot of their products in these warehouses here in Nevada, and then once somebody makes an order, say online or at a Walmart store in California, they can quickly take these products from here in Sparks and just truck them overnight across I-80 and get them to California in a timely manner. So so that's kind of one of the economic shifts that you see here over the past 50, 60 years in the post-war era.
Wow, you said that was 1949?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, so you see that. Even today, you just see that shift with the warehousing economy that's here in Northern Nevada, and it's still very important to us today. But even too, when you look at things like the divorce trade and divorce tourism, like even in around 1970, that's when you see kind of a drop off in that tourism in a way, because other states liberalize their divorce laws.
Sure.
So you see a sharp drop off in the amount of people that are just coming here to get their 6-week divorce, and so you don't really have that residency requirement anymore in other states, or you don't have those issues anymore, and so that tends to drop off around 1970, the divorce trade. So that's a big shift. So you no longer have that, but then you also have the corporate casinos that start coming in the 70s, like the Nugget, the Grand Sierra Resort, or something, not the Grand Sierra Resort, but you just see like all these different resorts that pop up here in Reno and Sparks area. And so you kind of see that shift into the economy to those big corporate casinos that are operating here in town. So there's a lot of different ways that the economy has transformed itself, just from, it used to be just more or less mining and the railroads here in Sparks, but now it's shifted to warehousing, it's shifted to casinos. So it's really so it's just really transformed. And even like the tech sector is coming in as well, from various tech companies are coming to Northern Nevada, and so you see a lot of those changes to the economy in Sparks.
And all of this taking place in what it really amounts to a little over a century.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah.
And you see that, and like what's interesting too is you just see that population explode. Like when in 1910, when the first census was done in Sparks, there was about 2,500 people, and then after in 1940, the population was about 6,000 people or so here in Sparks. But then in 1950, the population nearly doubles. It's up to about 11,000, but since 1950, now we have about 108,000 people living here in Sparks, and even I'm just amazed that there has been that much growth. Like I just looking at the numbers, it's like, wow, like there's just a lot of growth going on here in Sparks, and so you just see that transformation of the economy, the amount of people that are coming in to the region just over the course of a century, and it's pretty mind-boggling.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for sharing so much about this city and its transformation. Before we head into the final segment of our podcast, I would love to shine a light back on the Railroad Museum. So recently, you had a pretty phenomenal event, the Great Western Steam Up event. Am I getting that name correct?
Yes, you are.
And can you talk about why that was so landmark, what an undertaking that was, and would it have been possible for any of those engines to have come through Sparks?
Oh, sure, absolutely. So it's during July 1st, from July 1st to July 4th, 2022, we had the Great Western Steam Up at the Nevada State Railroad Museum, and so this was a major event for us. We had about 7,500 visitors come to the museum during those 4 days. And we had it was actually one of the largest, if not the largest, ticketed event in Carson City's history.
Wow!
And so we had a lot of visitors come in. We had about 10 different steam locomotives that were in operation during that weekend from various railroads that had ties to Nevada. And so we had various locomotives operating. We had vendors. We had entertainment, live entertainment. We had musicians. We had a beer garden. We had a visit from the Sparks Heritage Museum. They were on hand. Jessica was there. Christine. We were pleased to have them at the museum as well. So we had like train rides, and we had a fire pumper from Virginia City there. Just lots of various pieces of railroad equipment, and it was just an amazing event. We had a really great time. It was really busy for us as a staff, but it was, and our volunteers. We couldn't have done an event like this without our volunteers, the Friends of the Nevada State Railroad Museum. They're our support organization that really helps us with these events. So without them, we couldn't have done an event like this. But yeah, it was a really great event for the museum, and people keep asking us if we're going to do this again next year. I don't think so. Because an event like this takes a lot of planning. We've been planning this event we've been talking about it for quite a while. And like the whole planning process, it takes a long time to plan an event like this. But maybe down the road, 5-10 years from now, maybe we do another event like this. But for right now, we just kind of want to take a break from all the excitement we had.
And did these locomotives, were they all under the purview of the museum, or were they transported from elsewhere? Most
of the locomotives were transported from other places. We had the Eureka and Palisade number 4 come from Las Vegas. We had a locomotive called the Chicken. And that was brought in it was actually operated on the Santa Cruz and Portland Cement Railroad in Santa Cruz, California. That locomotive was brought in from California. A lot of locomotives were brought in from California, but almost all of them, except for the Chicken, had ties to Nevada. There was a locomotive from the Bluestone Mining Corporation, which operated out in Smith Valley. So we had a locomotive from there. We had several Virginia and Truckee Railroad locomotives that came in. Right now we have the Genoa and the J.W. Bowker. They're on loan right now from the California State Railroad Museum for a 2-year loan. So they're actually going to be here on display for another 2 years. So if you want to come down and see those locomotives, they're really unique locomotives, and they haven't been to Nevada probably about the 1940s.
Wow.
So it's really cool that they're back here at our museum, and we have them on display right now in the Jacobson Interpretive Center at the museum. So you can come by and see some more pieces of Nevada Railroad history. But all the locomotives that we had, except for one, had ties to Nevada railroading. Oh, and also that we had the Tahoe number 5 from the Nevada County Narrow Gauge. This locomotive is a sister locomotive to our museum's locomotive, the Glenbrook. The Glenbrook and the Tahoe were built around the same time in 1875.
Wow.
And so they operated up at the Carson and Tahoe Lumber and Fluming Company, which is a railroad that ran between Glenbrook and up to Spooner Summit. And they hauled lumber from the mills at Lake Tahoe at Glenbrook all the way up to Spooner Summit. And then from there, the lumber would be put into flumes and taken down to Carson City, and then be used. Then it would be hauled by the Virginia and Truckee up to the Comstock to be used either as fuel or like square set timbering in the mines or for construction supplies. So that was kind of cool to have those two locomotives together, and both of them still operate today. The Glenbrook operates, and the Tahoe was just recently restored to operation this past year in 2022. So it was just really cool to have them together because they hadn't operated together since 1898.
Wow.
And so it was fun to have them both at the museum at the same time under steam, and being able to see that play out was a lot of fun and really exciting for our visitors to take advantage of that.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Now, if anyone wants to visit the museum, what are your hours of operation?
So we're open Thursday through Monday, 9 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. And we're just down the road in Carson City, about 35-minute drive from here in Sparks. We have lots of great items on display. As I was mentioning, we have the Bowker and the Genoa, which are on loan from the California State Railroad Museum. We have the McKean motor car, which was constructed in 1910. There were 152 of these McKean motor cars built between 1905 and 1917, and even some of them actually ran here in Sparks back in the early 1900s. But we have the only one in the world that's fully restored and operable, and so you can come down and take a look at that. It's a former Virginia and Truckee railroad motor car. So yeah, we do have lots of historic equipment that you can come see. We have one of the largest collections of 19th century railroad equipment in the United States, and a lot of it, and most of it, operated here in Nevada on the Virginia and Truckee Railroad and various railroads throughout the state of Nevada. So it's a really unique collection and definitely worth a visit.
Oh, absolutely. Now, to end, I would love to ask you what we call the big three questions that we ask all of our guests. So the first question is, what sparks you about Sparks? What do you think makes it a unique place to live, work, or visit?
I would say for me, I really enjoy the history of Sparks. As you know, somebody who's interested in railroads and transportation, I've always been interested in the railroad history of Sparks. I'm just fascinated with how this used to be a large, how the railroad here had a big influence on the city, and then over the past 50, 60 years, how it's declined, but it's still a major part of the city's history. And I like how that people here embrace their railroad history, their railroad heritage here in Sparks. So I always find that fascinating. I kind of like I also enjoy the different neighborhoods. I like all the older houses that as you step away from the tracks to the north and you make your way towards Prater Way and in that area, like I just really like the old neighborhoods. I like that it's retained a lot of its character from that time. But I also like that in Victorian Square, how there's been a lot of redevelopment, and so it seems like even though that we're retaining a lot of the historic homes and everything, we're also still thinking about the future in terms of providing more housing and hopefully redeveloping more Victorian Square and along Victorian Avenue, and just to make sure that get lots of it'd be cool to have lots of smaller businesses and things like that to attract more people to the city of Sparks. So I don't know. I think there's just a lot. I think there's a lot going on in Sparks, and I think there's a lot of opportunities for growth. And I'm always happy to see that happening here in the city.
That's amazing. Do you have a favorite story or a moment from Sparks' history that is your particular favorite? This could either be a personal memory that you witnessed or something that you've come across in your research.
So this is probably a little bit obscure, but I was just thinking about the last day of operation for the streetcar line here in Sparks. And to me, there was something that happened on that day that I thought was really fascinating. It's one of my favorite parts of the Sparks history. So on September 6, 1927, that was the final day of operation for the Reno Traction Company. And so on that day, they abandoned their line between Reno and Sparks for their streetcars. But what I found fascinating in my research was what happened on the last run between Reno and Sparks. So the final streetcar left Reno probably around midnight or so, and was going to get to Sparks around 12:30 or so. And so as the streetcar was coming into Sparks, the streetcar was very busy. There were a lot of patrons on board because it's the last run and everything. But what I thought was kind of interesting when I was doing my research was that the motorman on the car, he's in charge of the car. He tied down the whistle on the car, and so for the last 5 or so minutes of the run leading into Sparks, he just had the whistle just constantly blowing for the final 5 minutes, and I just found that amusing because it's after midnight, and the resident, I guess a lot of residents complained about this, and they called the police and told them about this, but it's what are you gonna do? It's the last run, they're going out of business after this run, so what are you gonna do? But it sounded like the riders really approved of this, and they had a great time with this. But I just thought that was an amusing story about Sparks history, a little bit obscure, but I just thought it was fascinating. Yeah, right.
That's awesome. And lastly, since we are a museum with a research center and a collections archive, our organization believes that there are countless stories and artifacts that are worth preserving that are local to the Truckee Meadows region. So with that in mind, is there an item that you either personally own or are aware of that you believe is museum worthy?
That's a good question. So I was thinking about this, and I didn't have anything in my personal collection that I could think of. And then I was thinking about things that could be preserved. And I was kind of struggling with that a little bit. However, I was thinking of things that I wish had been preserved. And one of them would be a Reno Traction Company streetcar.
Oh, wow.
Because I think it would have been kind of cool if we could have kept one of those. Because the early Reno Traction Company streetcars that operate between Reno and Sparks, they actually came from San Francisco. And there's some debate over whether or not they're actually cable cars that were just turned into streetcars that could be operated here in Sparks. And so I think because it's because they have that classic cable car look to them, when you see them. So even though we don't know if any exist today of those streetcars, I think it was a lost opportunity to be able to have one of those in a museum. So I was kind of thinking that would have been a great item to have because it's just they were really unique cars, and it would have been a lot of fun if we could still have one of them today and maybe have it in operation or at least in a museum collection somewhere. Do
you know what happened? Were they transported out? Were they scrapped for parts?
Yep, they were scrapped in the 1920s. There is some thought that maybe one of them exists, but nobody knows where that is. I think there was one of the car bodies was purchased by somebody in Sparks, but the latest information I have on that is from about 1960. So wow. I don't know between 1960 and now, I don't know if that car if it still survives somewhere in Sparks or anywhere in the area. It may be gone completely. But if it still exists and somebody has it, consider calling the Sparks Heritage Museum.
Maybe one of our listeners will know.
Yeah, right?
Well, thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast today. It was lovely talking with you.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Jessica. I really appreciate it.
The Sparks Museum podcast is funded in part by a grant from the Nevada Humanities and the National Endowment for the Humanities. It is produced and recorded at the podcast recording studio at Sparks' own AntSpace Co-working Entrepreneurial Hub, a place for entrepreneurs, made by entrepreneurs. We really want to get the word out about our brand new audio series, so please spread the word about our new podcast by taking a moment to rate, review, and share this episode. Do you have a favorite story of Sparks that you want to hear on the podcast? Email info@sparksmuseum.org to share any recommendations. We would love to hear from you. We also invite you to visit the Sparks Heritage Museum on 814 Victorian Avenue. The museum is open Tuesdays through Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Please come visit and be a part of our ongoing efforts to tell the Sparks story. We'll see you next time.